A Misfit in Moscow, a memoir or secrets from a British diplomat. We are very grateful today to have on our show someone who is from a very realistic perspective and not from some of those that we've had in the past who like to give a, shall we say, creative interpretation of events that seek to create an outcome that is desirable as opposed to the one that really exists. This guy is an exception to that. He's an actual regular person who sees things the way they actually are, wants good outcomes, but doesn't have the fiction that goes along with it. And so that's such a breath of fresh air, and we were very grateful to have him on today. Ian Proud from UK. I believe you're coming to us from London right now. Is that right?
No, I'm from Hampshire.
Hampshire.
That's right. So beautiful we made it again in the US.
That's right. So, welcome to the show. We're really grateful that you've taken the time out to come to us today.
Thanks, Danny. I really admire your work.
Well, listen, truly, it is a breath of fresh air to have somebody come on, especially who was in a diplomatic position that is willing to say, here's what the truth is. And I wonder if you could just talk to us just for a second about how much time you spent in the British Embassy in London. I'm sorry, in Moscow. What your role was there, and why you wrote this book at all.
So I was in Moscow from July 2014, which was the point at which the kind of heaviest, at that time, European and US sanctions came into effect against Russia following the onset of the Ukraine crisis. And I kind of went through the Salisbury nerve agent attack. I survived that because I was kind of due to go in the summer of July 2018 anyway. But I stayed on until January 2019 because we were down on our bare bones in terms of staff, because 2/3 of our staff had been kicked out of the embassy in the diplomatic tit for tat. So I was there for 4.5 years. But actually before being in Moscow, I organised a G8 summit in Northern Ireland, which was the last time that Vladimir Putin actually came to Great Britain. So I kind of saw Putin up close and personal. And I've been kind of following, therefore, Russia affairs from 2013 pretty much to date, because after I got back from Moscow, I was involved in kind of sanctioning. I was Mr. Sanctions, for want of a better term, was Moscow. I had lots of other jobs, but that was one of my main jobs, I suppose. For better or worse.
I'm going to ask you some questions specifically about the sanctions part in a minute. But what is it that led you to write this book, as opposed to just saying, all right, I didn't like some of this stuff, but I'm just going to retire and go home? Why write this book?
So I think I'm a firm believer in sort of keeping state secrets and never disclosing them. I'll say that from the start. But I also believe if you want to talk, you got to walk, right? So, without necessarily revealing any kind of state secrets, I still wanted to express an opinion on what I consider to be a failing policy towards Russia. Not just failing in the context of what happened in 2022, but what had been failing pretty much since the back end of 2013, when the Ukraine crisis really started to unfold with kind of the Maidan, the Lithuania summit, and all those things. And I had a kind of front row seat, if you like, this slow-moving train crash that you could see coming down the tracks, but kind of stuck in the rail car, unable to escape. So I had a kind of close-up view of that happening. And I reached the point where I just wanted to say, well, actually, kind of maybe we need to think about things we could have done better to have prevented this utter catastrophe we have in Ukraine today, which is all-out war for the first time since the Balkans conflict in 30 years ago.
And what did you get any pushback from your colleagues or any surprise? If I understand correctly, like if I was going to write a book when I came out of the Army, I had to have it cleared through public affairs before it would go out. And I assume you had something similar to make sure it didn't have any secrets in it. How was that received by the British diplomatic corps?
I wouldn't say they were happy about it, but there's a process, and we like processes. The process was followed in a respectful way. They chopped out about 4,000 words. It's a bargain, we had to kind of negotiate, take this out, and we'd meet somewhere in the middle. But we ended up in a place where they were satisfied that I hadn't revealed anything compromising to UK national security, and I felt satisfied that I'd aired my views. And I think what comes out is a kind of readable book that talks about, the warts and all perspective of how things have gone badly downhill, frankly, over the past 10 years.
Yeah, and I actually I bought a copy on Amazon, so I actually read part of it, and in fact I want to ask you a few things that you wrote about, and if you could kind of explain a little bit of the context of each. Gary, if you could throw that first one up there. one of the things you wrote right at the beginning, I believe, was, however, I'm also a realist. I believe the core purpose of diplomacy and statesmanship is to manage relationships between states to prevent conflict. It seems the utmost folly to believe that we could resolve our disputes with Russia through isolation and cancellation. What does that mean when you say isolation and cancellation in this context?
So isolation has really taken the form of all the sanctions that we put on place, and we sanction everything. We even sanction the Eurovision Song Contest. We've sanctioned singing. We've sanctioned sport. I mean, the Ukrainian government even tries to sanction cosmetics companies that have Russian terms on their lipstick. Everything is being sanctioned. So this is utter isolation or attempt to isolate. But of course, the reality has been that Russia simply turned to the east, built up its relations with China and other kind of countries in Asia. So we tried to isolate Russia kind of economically, socially, culturally, but it hasn't worked. And cancellation is when we feel so vexed, by Russia's behaviour, our choice was not to talk to Russia. We refused on the basis of principle not to talk to Russia because we disagreed with their actions. But actually, my view is, when you disagree with somebody, that's the time to talk to them more, to make sense of, well, what are we not understanding about where you're coming from, and let us help you understand where we're coming from to try and at the very least deconflict tensions, to prevent the descent into all-out kind of hostility. Which
and I wonder if you could tell us, since you were Mr. Sanctions and you were head of a lot of that. So obviously, based on what you said already, so far as you thought it was silly, some of the things that we're doing, it's not going to have any effect. What was the process and the thought process, even better, behind what the intention was, especially if they were listening to you at all, and you could tell them, okay, I hear what you're telling me to sanction, and that's my job, so I'm going to do it, but it's not going to have the outcome that you expect. How did all that part go?
I don't think it was really what ministers wanted to hear. Sanctions became an end in themselves. Because if you think about it, sanctions are really an alternative to all-out kind of conflict. We've gone down the sanctions route because we don't want to fight a conventional warfare with Russia. So, sanctions is a kind of less bad option than all-out warfare, and that position has not changed to this day. In fact, we cling to sanctions as the only thing that we've got in our arsenal to kind of modify Russian behavior, but it manifestly hasn't modified Russian behavior. In fact, it's actually elevated their feelings of resentment against us, with the results that we see kind of today. So, but feeding that back to London, met with kind of a stony response by and large, because certainly ministers, Philip Hammond became Foreign Secretary in the summer of 2014. From that point on, the ministerial position became just very, very hard over, on Russia sanctions. Well,
now, it seems to me that at least in the past, or maybe even only in theory, maybe it's never been this way, but it seems like, at least conceptually, sanctions are supposed to be to try to compel behavior from an adversary, to make them take action that you want, so that if they do, then you take the sanctions off to show that there's a reward for doing it our way, to give them more reason to work with us. But it seems now that, as you said a second ago, that they're almost a means to themselves. Like, I don't care if they do what they want, I just want to punish them. Is that, do you see it that way?
Absolutely correct. And, to reinforce that point, there's never really been any articulation of, what are the steps that Russia needs to take for sanctions to be removed in some way, or at least reduced in some way. And part of that problem is because sanctions were critically linked to this bizarre notion of the full implementation of the Minsk II agreement, a document that lots of people talk about, but I suspect very few people have read. This agreement between Ukraine and the separatists in the Donbass, kind of facilitated by Germany and France and the OSCE, with kind of Russia participating in the talks, as well. In the summer of 2015, sanctions became linked. The removal of sanctions became linked to the full implementation of the Minsk II agreement, and this is something that very few people actually really understand in terms of the detail of how sanctions have evolved in the way that they have. But the problem with that was that actually Ukraine has never met its kind of obligations under the Minsk II agreement. So, this notion of the full implementation immediately became ridiculous by virtue of the fact that Ukraine would never, meet its obligations.
I remember actually on numerous occasions, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has often said that this war was basically forced on that Russia took this war. It was unprovoked and premeditated. Actually, that's what President Biden said. But Jens Stoltenberg has also said that as evidence, he said, the Minsk Accords were there, but Russia never adopted them, never intended to. But then information has come out since that at least it's been reported that the French and the Germans in particular never intended for Minsk to be accomplished. They just wanted to buy time for Ukraine. What do you know about the truth behind that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think Hollande has said that, hasn't he? Former President Hollande of France, and Merkel has flapped at that a bit. But I just think they're retrofitting their narratives to suit modern circumstances, to be perfectly honest. I mean, at the time, the Minsk II agreement was a really good example of European statespersonship, working with Russia and Ukraine. And it was a credit to them that they pulled it off, because it was quite a landmark agreement. That they kind of reinterpreting, that now, I think is slightly kind of tawdry, personally speaking. But the problem was the implementation of Minsk, and actually kind of with the US.
So then are you saying, like, at the time in the 2015 timeframe, they actually did intend for it to reach a negotiated settlement or to solve the problem, so it wasn't
Absolutely. There's a whole process around the Minsk II agreement. The Trilateral Contact Group, the OSCE, was kind of closely involved in that. These Normandy format meetings. Zelensky even went to a Normandy format meeting in 2019. He actually met Vladimir Putin as part of that process. So, there's a whole architecture kind of around it. But the fundamental problem was that, and anybody can look up the Minsk II agreement and read it themselves. Just look it up. I encourage people to do so. Read through it. There are very clear responsibilities on Ukraine, on a process moving towards devolve responsibility, elections, and so on in the Donbass.
And why would Ukraine not do that? It seems it would be in their interest to actually accommodate it, to get rid of the pressure.
Well, there's absolutely no domestic political support in Ukraine for that to happen. The Verkhovna Rada was totally against that. This was whipped up in terms of, this would be a concession to kind of the Russians if we offer the separatists some sort of devolution, and we're basically kind of giving in to the Russians. And of course, the US government, the British government, I'm sad to say, put no pressure on Ukraine to comply, and therefore we had this kind of drift, while at the same time critically insisting that sanctions remained on Russia until there's this full implementation of the Minsk agreements. It's a totally bizarre and crazy situation, but believe me, anybody can look it up online. I'm not making it up. I mean, that's that is really how it's evolved.
Okay, so moving on to the next one here. Gary, throw up that next one there. One of the other things is about deterring Russia. And one of the things you wrote is, as I left King Charles Street for the final time at the end of a 24-year career in His Majesty's diplomatic service, I paused to look at the digital display of the Foreign Office's priorities. I saw that the UK's top foreign policy priority is to, quote, deter Russia and support Ukraine, end quote. Makes sense, you might think. We should support Ukraine. But then I asked myself, deter Russia from what? We didn't deter Russia in 2022, or indeed in 2014. It is pure fantasy to believe that the UK has deterred Russia in the past or can in the future. That's kind of a big statement, because that's what we claim to want to do all the time, is deter Russia. So let's ask the first part of that question first. Deter Russia from what?
Well, yeah, exactly. Russia's taking control of almost 20% of Ukrainian territory. What are we trying to deter? They're in Ukraine, and they're gradually kind of nudging further towards the west, in the Donbass at the moment, according to the latest kind of report. So we haven't deterred, that. We didn't, deter, even though we had some intelligence on that, a possible move on Crimea in 2014. We didn't deter the solidifying of the line of contact in the Donbass that, happened in 2014. Russia feels totally unconstrained in its actions in Ukraine because of our policy, which has been over-reliant on sanctions. And what I like to say, the best way I kind of characterize it is this kind of, we're stuck in a no man's land between war and peace. We don't want peace with Russia. We hate Russia. Russia is the aggressor. Russia's done all the bad things. but we don't war either. You know, we're not sending our troops. You know, Ukraine has asked us countless times at the start of the war to close the skies. You know, they wanted to draw us in, direct boots on the ground. Macron has been talking about it more recently. There's been no appetite from that, from some NATO countries. We've never wanted to commit to a war, but neither have we wanted to commit to peace. And caught in the middle of that is Ukraine, and that is the crux of it. What that means is, you know, Russia feels totally unconstrained in its actions because of the fudge, you know, that our policy has created between those two positions.
And so it seems like any opportunity that the West had to modify Russian behavior was forfeited when you know, we don't want to even talk to them. And so now they're unconstrained, and they don't seem to be worried about anything that we think or do or say, which kind of leads to the next point here that you made in the book, about negotiated settlements and what we should do. Unable to outsmart Putin and unwilling to fight, we should, for the first time in a decade, push for a ceasefire and support Ukraine in negotiating a just peace. Not talking to Putin and hoping he'll eventually die from a mysterious and unspeakable illness is not a strategy. And the longer the guns, not butter Tories encourage the war to continue, pumping billions of pounds worth of weapons into Ukraine with few conditions attached, the less safe Britain becomes. Why do you argue that the failure to push for a ceasefire makes Britain less safe?
Well, because, you know, gradually, inexorably, we're being sort of drawn into, you know, a possible, you know, future conflict directly with Russia, you know, through our policy, which would be a lot worse if we'd kind of go into a full-blown conflict now than it would have been in 2014 had we intervened militarily, you know, at that time. We're being dragged, kind of kicking and screaming by an angry, disenfranchised Zelensky closer to, you know, a cataclysmic kind of uncontrollable sort of direct military conflict with Russia through a policy that we've been pushing for the past decade. And it's, you know, who doesn't want peace? I mean, you know.
Well, apparently somebody doesn't. That was the next question I was going to ask, is in the first part of that. Why won't Britain support trying to get the best peace they could get for Ukraine now?
Well, because, you know, right back in February 2022, in March 2022, you know, Boris Johnson was up there. You know, we're going to support you for as long as it takes. You know, streets were even named in Ukraine after Boris Johnson. You know, we've staked our kind of credibility as kind of Ukraine's closest kind of European ally at that time. I don't think we are necessarily today on supporting them for as long as it takes. And the mistake Zelensky's made has been to believe us. You know, because clearly there isn't an unlimited shelf life on our support, or indeed on, as we know now, US support for what's happening in Ukraine. So, you know, we staked our credibility on, you know, in Boris Johnson's actual words, you know, Putin has to lose and be seen to lose. Look it up. I mean, that's something Boris Johnson said, you know, right at the start of the war. And when you set that policy line, it's hard to go back from that and say, well, now let's sue for peace. You know, we all know that Johnson rocked up in Kiev, you know, midway through the kind of Istanbul talks, and he's been quite honest in saying he didn't want Zelensky to agree to the settlement that was on the table. There's no secrets about that. He said it himself, and in fact, Liz Truss, you know, was at public in the Manor House in London 3 weeks later, basically saying the same thing. You know, we discouraged, you know, Zelensky from taking what at the time, you know, was a fairly decent offer for all sides that was on the table in quite difficult circumstances, obviously.
Yeah. And so this next piece here is probably not, you probably really, I've kind of already answered this one, but Gary, if you can throw it, there you go. I also wanted to write a memoir that anyone could pick up and read to understand what it's really like to be a British diplomat in Russia, and suggest with the greatest of respect that UK foreign policy there has failed. What could happen, or what could be done to undo that failure, or even is it possible, given the history of everything that's been done and all these claims made by whether it was Liz Truss or Boris Johnson or the current Rishi Sunak, is there any way to undo this failure?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, the people the Russians will listen to most of the Americans, not us, because they hate us now even more than they hated us when I was in kind of Moscow, which was quite a lot then, you know, quite frankly. So, you know, I think Putin ultimately, he's not going to back down, but he will cut a deal if you know, the Americans lean in. And Biden's not going to make that happen. It'd be political suicide for him to do so in an election year, because, you know, his whole policy, the policy of the Democrats, you know, his policy and Obama's policy would have been seen to have failed. So it's not really in his interest to, cut a deal. So we're in a bit of a holding pattern right now, it seems to me. But I think Putin has sent the signals that he'd be willing to cut a deal. It just needs kind of grown-up statesmanship to meet in the middle, encourage Zelensky to talk as well, and kind of go from there.
If it's grown-up statesmanship, I'm not sure that there's going to be a lot of people standing in line for that one on any side of the Western alliance. Real quick question: speaking of Putin, did you ever have any direct interaction with him during your time in office?
I actually saw him in the UK when I was at the J8 Summit. I saw him, but I didn't personally speak to him. I mean, nobody speaks to Putin. British ambassador, nobody. Really, they have the very formulaic set piece events where he goes and speaks on the stage. And I went to quite a few of those actually. Really illuminating to see him. There's really good. I suggest you look it up. It's kind of a long watch, but Megyn Kelly, the journalist, did a real kind of elbows out interview with him in St. Petersburg in 2017. It's fascinating. I'd really encourage you to watch it because she was kind of fearless.
I know of it, but
he liked it. He liked that. He kind of likes the cut and thrust. He likes people who are going to have a good argument with him. Russians like that kind of, that direct argumentative style. I think, we're scared of that. I think that's the truth of it. We're scared of dealing with Putin.
What do you think of the argument that Putin will never make a deal? He breaks every negotiation or a deal he ever makes. He won't live up to it. We can't trust him, so it's pointless to even talk about a negotiated settlement. That's one of the common phrases I hear on this side of the pond. What do you think?
Do you think Putin trusts us? Do you think he trusts us to stand by our deal? Clearly, we don't trust him, but believe me, he doesn't trust us. And the thing is, I remember in 2014, not long after I'd been there, I met a senior staff in the presidential administration, in the center of Moscow. And she said to me then, this is 2014, I said, well, what about, gradual kind of rapprochement between, Russia, the UK, the US, kind of the West. And then in 2014, she said, not possible. It's going to take at least a decade because all the trust is gone. That was then.
Wow.
So there's no trust on both sides. Clearly, we have massive trust issues with Putin, and rightly so. But believe me, he doesn't trust us either. But it's the job of the big folk, the statespeople, the presidents, the prime ministers, to actually kind of swallow it, talk to each other, and look at the bigger picture, I'm afraid to say. And that's what we get paid for.
That didn't used to be a hard thing. There used to be, even in the United States, we would talk to anyone. I mean, we talked to the Soviet Union. We talked to the Chinese. I mean, we would talk to anyone, even if we didn't like them. We even talked to what's the guy's name from Cuba? Castro. We even talked to him sometimes. But those days,
Reagan and Gorbachev's fireside chats.
Exactly. Yeah, and unfortunately, that's no longer the crew we have anymore. Listen, I want to shift gears a little bit here and take advantage of your experience and your knowledge about what things are like in reality behind the scenes. So I'm going to play a series of clips here about some leading Western figures and some of the things that they say out loud. And I wonder if you could just, from your experience and knowledge about how things are really working, maybe what's being said behind the scenes and the closed doors about these people, and do they mean what they're saying here, or are they trying to just paint a message for some other purpose? So the first one I want to play here is from November of 2022, when the U.S. former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, came up and talked to the public, and this was from the Pentagon, after Ukraine had basically driven the Russians out of Kharkiv region and had forced Russia out of Kherson City. Those were the two hugest, as it turned out, probably ever in the war, successes that Ukraine had on the ground tactically. And some people were suggesting it was time to negotiate from a position of strength there, while other people were saying Russia's on their back legs now. We need to keep going so that we can win and drive Russia back to the 1999 borders. Here's what Milley said on November.
The probability of a Ukrainian military victory, defined as kicking the Russians out of all of Ukraine, to include what they define or what they claim as Crimea, the probability of that happening anytime soon is not high, militarily. Politically, there may be a political solution where politically the Russians withdraw. That's possible. You want to negotiate from a position of strength. Russia right now is on its back. The Russian military is suffering tremendously. Leaders have been, the leadership is really hurting bad. They've lost a lot of casualties, killed and wounded. They've lost, I won't go over exact numbers because they're classified, but they've lost a tremendous amount of their tanks and their infantry fighting vehicles. They've lost a lot of their fourth and fifth generation fighters and helicopters and so on and so forth. The Russian military is really hurting bad. So you want to negotiate at a time when you're at your strength and your opponent is at weakness. And it's possible, maybe, that there'll be a political solution. All I'm saying is there's a possibility for it. That's all I'm saying.
Now that angered a lot of people in the United States that he had the audacity to say that when they had just succeeded. But how did you feel or what do you think when you saw him say that?
I think he's talking good military sense, to be perfectly honest. I think he's kind of less confident on his political lines, but in terms of his military knowledge, clearly, it's hard to kind of question that. And we see that today. I mean, Ukraine hasn't, his prophecy has come true, right? I mean, Ukraine, after these kind of stunning victories in Kharkiv and Kherson, hasn't made any significant further advances. In fact, the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way now towards towards the Russian side. On the political deal, I think he was just suggesting that actually if now's probably going to be the best chance you get. The Russians were demoralized at the time. They deployed a fairly small force to conquer kind of quite a large kind of area, and part of the kind of retaking of Kherson and Kharkiv was done very quickly. I mean, the Russians didn't really fight for that land. They're just kind of trimming their line of contact to a more manageable kind of proportions. They were demoralized. They're having resupply issues. We all know that. But actually, I think what the general was kind of foreseeing in the future was kind of bounce back by the Russian military-industrial complex, where what we see today, they're vastly overmatching us in terms of production of military material. And the supply chain is now much better than it was back in 2022, and I think the recruitment chain is much better too, because they're able to kind of bring in more new people than Ukraine can. So
I believe that this was during the administration of Boris Johnson during this time, November 2022. It's probably silly to suggest, but was there any possible willingness or appetite among the British to say, hey, let's listen to him and seek a negotiated settlement?
Absolutely not. None at all.
No.
None at all.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. I guess, that was based on what you've already told me. I guess that was kind of self-evident. Next, let's go to
even today. I mean, Cameron just walked up in Washington, was it last week? And he was peddling the same line that lady from the Marshall Plan was.
I've got that one to show here in a minute. I actually have that.
Money for money. I mean, it hasn't. The UK line hasn't changed, my friend, since 2013.
Yeah.
Back end.
I actually have that clip. We're going to show it in a minute.
Very good.
But next, I want to go to Zelensky, who's trying to make the picture that this is not just about Ukraine. It's about you. I'm fighting for you.
I am grateful to every leader and every country that takes part in this joint work of ours and confirms by their participation that the rules-based world order must be restored for everyone on Earth without exception. Ukrainian initiatives are gradually becoming global initiatives. I am grateful to everyone who helps us with this. Month after month, we are ramping up our Ukrainian artillery production. Ukraine has sufficient potential to make it through this difficult path of war. We have the potential to rally the world. We have the potential to win. The key is to believe in ourselves, to believe in Ukraine.
He's saying that the Ukraine issues are becoming global issues, and with the whole world is dependent on this. Did that message ever resonate with anybody, especially behind the scenes in the diplomatic corps, that this wasn't just about Ukraine, this was about everybody?
Well, I mean, I flipped that on the head. The rules-based world order that he talks about is actually a UK and a US line we've kind of fed him. He's talked about this idea of a rules-based international order. That's a line that kind of we've very much kind of given him. I mean, Zelensky himself has been pushing the line that actually, what happens, in Ukraine matters for the whole world, because this fiction that Russia will invade Estonia, Poland, Lithuania, take a pick from any in the list after they kind of go through Ukraine, when there's no evidence to kind of support that. But in terms of Ukraine being a global struggle. I mean, I think he's one of the few people who can sees it that way. Everybody else kind of wants it to be contained. They don't want Ukraine to be defeated. Neither do they want conflict to kind of seep across the border into into the European mainland either.
But do they believe that? Do they believe that he's coming for us next if he gets through Ukraine, or do they just not like Russia, and so they want him to be defeated just categorically? But do they really think that if Ukraine falls, that they're next?
No, in the West, you mean? No, it's a total comms line. I mean, people like Stoltenberg will trot out all the time. There are all these kind of comms lines, like the Minsk agreements, that gets thrown out all the time. Sanctions are working, that gets thrown out all the time. They're coming for Estonia next. Putin's going to die from a mysterious illness. All these things, they're just comms lines. Russia would be absolutely
that makes more sense.
Stone cold crazy to invade a NATO country given the Article 5 commitments, and it's really as simple as that. They know it,
and speaking of Article 5 commitments, I believe this was early in the war. This is Jens Stoltenberg talking about how important it is for NATO and Ukraine.
Let me be clear. Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. And over time, our support will help you make this possible.
Okay, so that was over a year ago. And then a few days ago, Secretary of State Blinken, even after, that was before the failed offensive, by the way. It's important to note. But now a year later, Secretary of State Blinken doubles down on it.
Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Our purpose at the summit is to help build a bridge to that membership and to create a clear pathway for Ukraine moving forward. We will see, I think, in the summit, very strong support for Ukraine going forward in its relationship with NATO.
Okay, I just have to scratch my head when I hear him say that I think there's going to be strong support for NATO in Ukraine going forward. But I got to think that behind the scenes in diplomatic channels where you used to work, that no one would ever want Ukraine in NATO. Am I off the base there?
Well, no, some countries do want Ukraine in NATO. The UK would like to see Ukraine in NATO. I think the US, probably sincere and wanted to see it. But some NATO countries don't want Ukraine to be in NATO.
But hold on. Why would any nation want Ukraine in NATO when they have this historic enmity with Russia? And if it ever turns into another future conflict, it's going to be war, and it's going to be Article 5. That's the part I don't understand.
Well, of course, that we shall, not me personally, but the UK and the US, certainly the Democrat Party in the US, going to share that enmity for the Russia too. So for them, they care less about the enmity, but the countries like Hungary, kind of Turkey, saying, well, hold on, guys, actually, this really isn't a good idea at all, and because of that. There is no route for Ukraine into NATO, while some key member states, or indeed any member states, could veto that. We've seen the kind of come on in approaches Sweden and Finland and the hurdles they've had to jump through to get Turkey to come on board with ratification of their membership. Ukraine has 10 times the difficulty that Sweden and Finland have faced. And nobody wants to let them in while war's raging anyway. So what are we offering them? We're going to come and rescue them after they've been defeated. What does it actually mean, NATO membership? Because
that's the part that just the practical. I mean, Blinken's talking like at the Washington summit later this year that like there's going to be a lot of movement for that, and the NATO charter itself says that you can't even join unless you have all your internal disputes resolved and all your border disputes resolved. Obviously, that's not going to happen for the foreseeable future. I mean, especially the internal divisions within Ukraine. So just fundamentally, that there's no practical path for Ukraine as far as the eye can see. So I don't know why they're talking like it's a near term or that it's a probability, which is, it just seems a puzzle to me.
And the critical thing is actually that, if you go back to the kind of March 2022 draft agreement that Zelensky ultimately didn't sort of run with, that included, in fact, during your very good counter foreign relations kind of discussion, it covered the fact that included clauses on Ukrainian neutrality, therefore not joining NATO. And actually, this was anathema to the UK and the US in particular. They're like, well, why basically it becomes very personalized. Why should Russia have a veto on Ukraine joining NATO? And that's really what it's all about. We don't want Russia to have scored some sort of victory by preventing Ukrainian membership of NATO, even if that concept itself is completely meaningless in practical terms.
It seems to me that there's a lot of emotional driven policy decisions being made here, and not ones based on Russia, because I can see it here and point to so much trouble and future headaches that you're just absolutely buying for yourself by even talking about putting NATO into Ukraine, as opposed to saying, yeah, go neutrality, just be neutral and be a buffer between us and Russia so we can be safe and you can do business with whoever you want. But now that we got a buffer between, it seems like on a practical level, that would be better for the West than to have them in NATO along with all the headaches, because now we don't have the headaches. Can you explain why that's not on the table?
I mean, to be honest, it's all really Putin's been pressing for since 2014 when this all kind of started, Ukrainian non-membership of NATO. I think it really just does come down to the emotionality of the politics. We just don't want Putin to win and be seen to win by effectively vetoing sort of Ukrainian membership. There's no sense or logic or grand strategy to any of this. Had we cut the deal,
I can accept that.
I
don't like it, but I can accept it.
Hundreds of thousands of whatever the agreed figure is. I don't think there is a really agreed figure, but we can all agree that very many people in Ukraine have died since that.
Exactly. And now then it seems that not only are we unwilling to make a deal with Putin because we hate him and whatever, now then it seems like that it's a reciprocal situation. Here's what he said in last December that really I think is starting to show after the failed after the November timeframe in 2022, Putin was back on his heels, no question about it, on the battlefield and also on the diplomatic front. But then when Ukraine failed in its offensive, and now he sees all of his industrial might kicking in, he sees his forces growing. Now all of a sudden he has a very different demeanor as we saw last December.
The first nuclear warheads have been delivered to the territory of Belarus, but just the first ones. The use of nuclear weapons undoubtedly is theoretically possible for Russia. We have more of these weapons than NATO countries do. They know that, and they keep telling us to start negotiations on reductions. Well, you know what? They can shove it.
I thought that, and I want your view on here. I thought that was a little bit uncharacteristic for the Putin that I have been tracking for years and following really since 1999 when he first came up to power. He didn't ordinarily talk in that, I guess, rough of language or so. How do you view that comment there, and based on your time that you at least engaged with Russia?
I think he feels more confident in his position, and the irony is that actually he's a person now who needs to cut a deal the least of all the main actors in this theatre. So he feels kind of confident, as you say, the military industrial complex, which he's been building up practically speaking since 2014, is going full bore. The tide is turning. His strategy is working because all he has to do is keep Ukraine fighting to kind of bleed NATO dry of ammunition and turn Ukraine into an economically failed state. And people are talking about a big Russian military offensive. He doesn't really even need to do that. I mean, he can just sit there in this kind of attritional sort of phase that he's in now, gradually kind of nudging the line of contact west. That's all he needs to do to actually kind of be putting NATO and Ukraine under considerable pressure. So that to me was, I thought that was kind of classic Putin when he's feeling actually at his most confident. But I think even though he's a character he probably needs to cut a deal the least, I think ultimately he would be willing to cut a deal if people were to come to the table, but nobody's willing to do that yet, as you know.
Now, earlier this year, Macron said, hey, maybe we should be strategic ambiguity and maybe we should send some troops to Ukraine to fight. And there was a bunch of maps that came out, and people speculated, well, maybe he would send troops in through Romania. Maybe they would help defend Odessa if that's where we're going on. And so then naturally people ask, well, what does Putin think about that? Here's what he said then.
Reuters agency, maybe it is a silly question, but nevertheless, Macron keeps saying about possibility of sending French European troops to Ukraine, and that's a matter of concern for the European nations. How do you think the full-fledged conflict between Russia and NATO, is it possible, and how probable is it? Well, I think everything is possible in the modern world, and as I said before, and it is clear to everyone that this will be one step away from a full-fledged World War III.
Is he right there? I mean, could it get to the point to where the West would, from a position of weakness and a vulnerable position, take action that could actually spawn a Russian use of nuclear weapons? What do you think about that?
I don't actually think he's talking about nuclear weapons in that context, to be perfectly honest. I think what he's talking about is if declared French troops on Ukrainian soil, then it's going to be weapons free for the Russian forces against them. And at that point, you get into the territory of French kind of losing, lives, publicly losing lives in Ukraine. And then, you get into the escalation spiral from there. I don't think he's necessarily talking about kind of a direct route into kind of tactical nuclear weapons use, but rather what would happen if suddenly French body bags are kind of publicly going back to Paris, and how that would start to kind of spin out of control with others, other NATO countries wanting to lean in, probably the UK and I'm less clear on the US, frankly, but certainly like the Poles and others, the Balts, wanting to pile in as well.
And do you think that under any circumstances,
then anything can happen, right?
Yeah. Do you think there are any circumstances that would cause Putin to actually use either tactical or theater nuclear weapons?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think you have to kind of read between the lines with it. Look at what Medvedev has been saying. As soon as Russia kind of formally, I mean, we don't recognize it, but Russia kind of annexed the 4 oblasts, in the south of Ukraine. As soon as they did that, they gave themselves, in terms of their kind of legalistic thinking, a trumped up reason to kind of justify to their own people the use of tactical nuclear weapons should there be any incursions into those spaces, by Ukrainian or kind of other NATO forces. So I think that's very clear. If the Ukrainians, or I don't frankly think it's going to happen, but NATO forces were to kind of push into the four oblasts that the Russia has kind of illegally, in my view, but nevertheless laid claim to, then I think that's the flashpoint when it happens right there. Maybe not in the oblast, but in the formations that are grouping up to kind of move in on that.
Yeah, and that's one thing which, of course, we do not ever want to see. No. Now moving back to which you'd mentioned a minute ago. Lord Cameron came to the United States ostensibly to try and encourage the Speaker of the U.S. House to pass a $60 billion budget for Ukraine. The reason, he said, to me, was a bit of a head scratcher.
What we face today is as simple as then. We have a tyrant in Europe who's trying to redraw borders by force, and there are 2 choices. You can appease that approach, or you can confront that approach. It is undoubtedly the right thing to confront it, and that is what we're doing by giving Ukraine such strong support.
Is he right? Is it a binary issue? It's either appease Russia, this tyrant who's wanting to redraw borders in Europe. Interesting, he didn't say Ukraine, but Europe, or push in and keep giving money to Ukraine.
Well, I think he's only actually set out kind of 2 or 3 possible options. Frankly, I think the irony about appeasement is that actually, it obviously comes from the lead up to kind of World War II, where we wanted to avoid the possibility of fighting, but the irony there is we've absolutely avoided the possibility of fighting Putin ever since kind of 2014 through our actions. So So appeasement has been through our own actions and actually, not deploying military force at an earlier stage to kind of de-escalate this at the time. Talking to Putin isn't appeasement now. I don't think we're far too far down the track to kind of even describe it in that way. I think the binary choice has always been between war and peace, not between peace and actually weapon supplies to Ukraine. I think that's a totally ridiculous kind of proposition. It doesn't really hold any water. We either have to fight Russia or we have to make peace, rather than to leaving Ukraine stuck in a muddy kind of body-filled no man's land in between the two policy positions. That is a binary choice, not appeasement or weapon supplies. I don't think that works at all.
And in this last one here, we have Rishi Sunak just before the offensive of Ukraine from last year. So I think that at least many people publicly, and I wonder if you can talk on this, if it was any different behind the scenes, but publicly, especially in this country, there was lots of optimism that this was going to push Russia back, that it was going to go to the Azov coast, cut their forces in half, and put their whole southern force structure at risk of future offensive operations. And heading into that, Rishi Sunak said this.
When Putin launched his war, he gambled that our resolve would falter, that he was wrong then, and he is wrong now. Russia's military is failing on the battlefield. Their economy is failing at home as we tighten the stranglehold of sanctions. And the image of the G7 leaders standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky in Hiroshima sent a powerful message to the world: we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
So we will stand for Ukraine as long as it takes, and the sanctions are biting and they're losing on the battlefield. Only none of those things were affected that were accurate even at that time.
Yeah, I mean, that was in May 2023, right? And actually kind of we'd hit lowest common denominator sort of in diminishing marginal returns on sanctions, quite soon after the war started, because, you have to bear in mind with sanctions, they've been in place since 2014, not since 2022. More sanctions were added in 2022, but, Russia had 8 years to kind of prepare itself to deal with sanctions, for an 8-year period before war had even started, and have been kind of readjusting their economy accordingly. So, when war started in 2022, their war chests have been properly kind of filled. They are ready to kind of withstand that economic shock. And if you look at the data now, they've actually they've adapted really well. I mean, obviously, some assets have been frozen, their reserve assets and so on, but they received a whopping current account surplus of like 238 billion in 2022 alone. That's twice as much as kind of Western military support and economic support to Ukraine in 2022 after the war started. And their economy is now churning along perfectly fine on pre-war kind of trends. They've moved their and actually have been since 2014, moving economically increasingly towards Asia. This hasn't all started in 2022. They've not had a big bucket of ice cold water chucked over them in 2022. They've been preparing for those 8 years. So that's what people always forget. Sanctions haven't worked because they've been responding to them for a long time, and they've had a good team in place with the central bank governor and the finance minister. And the other thing too about sanctions is that actually far bigger things have happened in terms of economic shocks to Russia over that time. They've had 2 oil price collapses. They've had COVID, all of which had a bigger economic shock on Russia than the effect of the sanctions themselves. I think what actually hurts them more, ironically, I think what hurts Russia more is the kind of social and cultural sanctions more than the economic sanctions, which they've largely kind of shrugged off now. I mean, it's painful for a short term, but I think the economic, the social and cultural sanctions almost hurt them more. Being excluded from the Olympics and the World Cup and the Eurovision Song Contest almost hurts them more, bizarrely, but there you go.
So where do you think this goes now? So we had on our show earlier today, we had a military expert that really graphically kind of laid out the projections on the battlefield, where things have been and where the two sides are, and how the basically the combat power capacity for Russia is probably, and in my view, is irrevocably in their favor. So if this war, and you kind of alluded to this a second ago, even if Russia doesn't do any big arrow movements and they just keep on methodically moving forward, they can eventually bleed the Ukraine side dry. So if we continue on with this fiction that Secretary Blinken said a couple of weeks ago, they're coming in NATO, so we're not going to negotiate an end because, we're going to keep going down this fiction path. But at some point, Ukraine can't keep going down the fiction path, and they will end up collapsing or breaking or something as Russia just keeps on moving to the west. What do you think will happen, and what should happen?
Well, I think what should happen is we should go to the kind of negotiating table as soon as we can, because what will happen is that the UK and the US in particular will encourage, it seems to me, Ukraine to kind of keep fighting if they believe that the line of contact won't move significantly in that time. That's a big risk if Russia launches a major kind of offensive that kind of breaks the line at some point. But the risk for Ukraine is not just military supply, it's economic sustainability of their position, because they're piling up massive debts just to kind of run the war effort.
Yeah.
In spite of the economic aid they receive from the West, in spite of the weapons, albeit in reduced supply, they receive from the West, the economic risk to them is as significant, arguably more significant than the military kind of risk. So I think they'll continue to become more indebted. They'll continue to lose territory. The big question mark is whether Putin really sees it in his interest to actually launch a major offensive this year. For that, I think you need to kind of watch how the kind of Crocus City debate falls out, because the Russians have been trying to pin that on the Ukrainians, and there's a reason for them to do that. And they may be doing that to kind of justify to their own domestic constituency some sort of deep push into Ukraine. I mean that all the kind of hot air, and there's a lot of it. You're no doubt following it yourself, Danny, that there's a reason they're doing that. I don't think we really understand what yet, but I mean, to me, it seems obvious. One of the possibilities which could be to justify as a much more harsh and deep cut into Ukraine. That's the big risk in this year. So yeah, let's see. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But I mean, I don't see, frankly, Biden or Sunak kind of encouraging Zelensky to come to the table. In fact, I think, I mean, it's really only Biden he'll probably listen to anyway, frankly. Do that. And that seems, frankly.
So last question here. In the event that the dynamics that appear on the ground continue on, and whether it's at the end of the summer, as some suggest, where the Ukraine army could break and basically collapse as an effective fighting force and bringing the war to an end, or it goes on for even a couple more years and it's just a slow strangulation, but it keeps going in this direction. What is going to be the diplomatic fallout for the West in general, the US and UK in particular, if all this mess that we keep saying and all this fiction we've been having proves that it finally collapses and Russia, instead of losing, comes out the winner no matter how much they want it to happen up there? What are the ramifications of that going forward for European security?
Well, I mean, there are two questions in that one question. I mean, there's, what are the political risks around that? I mean, your country, my country, we both have elections this year, and it's in the interest of both ruling parties not to have, Zelensky can seem to fail during this election year, right? So that's a big, political risk right there. If Ukraine, is defeated, I don't really know how you define defeat, given it's already lost 20% of its territory. There's no evidence that Russia wants to take the whole of Ukraine,
right,
including actually Kiev, given the massive loss of life that would be involved in some sort of assault there. So I mean, I think Russia has already won. There's no evidence they want to kind of take the whole of the country, including actually Kiev. If you look on Telegram, I know you check the Telegram channels yourself, but Medvedev has even produced a map of Ukraine in which the Ukrainians actually keep Kiev and a little bit of land around it. I don't know if you've seen that kind of map that Medvedev has put out. So, what does defeat look like? I mean, it doesn't look like a total conquest of Ukraine. As you've been saying, as John Mearsheimer and others have been saying, that's never really been on the card. So defeat is already staring them in the face. I mean, defeat actually means economic collapse and a basket case economic state that, the West, the European Union and the US, frankly, will have to prop up for years to come, rather than sort of cutting a deal now, which, most realists would argue would be the more sensible approach.
They do. And we'll see what ends up happening. We're going to continue tracking here. But thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing with us. And thanks for writing this book. And it's been very fascinating. We look forward to having you back again in the future.
Thanks, Danny. Really great to meet you. All the best.
Thank you very much. And appreciate you guys coming with us. As always, we are unintimidated and uncompromised, and we're going to bring you all the information, even when it's uncovering some unpleasant truths about some of our own senior folks behind the scenes here, as we did today. We will be back on again tomorrow. We have some shows. We have Jason Beardsley back with us tomorrow. You're going to want to tune in for that. And we're always going to be tracking all the issues. If anything happens with the Israeli-Hamas situation or anything further breaks here in the Russia-Ukraine war, you can count on us to be with you. So keep watching, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.